Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, a future king was learning lessons that would reshape his entire approach to health and wellness. These weren't the typical royal protocols of state dinners and ceremonial duties. Instead, they were the unconventional, sometimes shocking wellness practices of Prince Philip, a man who believed that true strength came not from tradition, but from breaking it. What Charles discovered from his father would later become the foundation of his own extraordinary approach to staying healthy well into his 70s, practices so unusual that even his closest advisors questioned their wisdom. This is the untold story of how a rebellious royal father passed down secrets that would keep his son thriving for decades. Charles Philip Arthur George stood at his bedroom window in Buckingham Palace, watching his father emerge from the gardens at dawn. It was 1965, and the young prince had been awakened by what sounded like someone chopping wood. But, as he peered through the morning mist, he realized his father wasn't wielding an axe. Prince Philip was engaged in what appeared to be a violent dance with an invisible opponent, his arms cutting through the air with military precision. This was Charles's first introduction to his father's morning routine, a practice that would profoundly shape his own approach to wellness for the rest of his life. Prince Philip had discovered martial arts during his naval service, but, unlike the gentle Tai Chi that was becoming popular among the upper classes, Philip practiced a hybrid form that combined elements of judo, boxing, and what he called Germanic calisthenics. The young Charles was both fascinated and bewildered. Royal children were typically introduced to riding, shooting, and fishing. Physical exercise meant proper sports with proper equipment, supervised by proper instructors. But here was his father, alone in the early morning, moving like a warrior preparing for battle. When Charles finally worked up the courage to ask about these mysterious morning sessions, Philip's response was characteristically direct. "Boy, your body is the only thing that truly belongs to you. Everything else, the titles, the palaces, the ceremonies, they're borrowed. But this," he said, flexing his considerable frame, "this is yours to command." Philip explained that he had learned this philosophy during his time in the Royal Navy, particularly during the challenging years of World War II. Unlike his royal relatives who relied on servants for everything, Philip had experienced true physical hardship. He had hauled ropes in freezing Atlantic storms, slept in cramped quarters, and learned that mental resilience came from physical strength. But Philip's approach to fitness was far from conventional, even by military standards. He had developed what he called functional monarchy training. This wasn't about building show muscles or achieving aesthetic goals. Instead, every exercise served a practical purpose for royal duties. He practiced standing at attention for extended periods, not just because protocol demanded it, but because he had developed specific techniques to maintain perfect posture without fatigue. One of Philip's most unusual practices involved what he termed ceremonial breathing. Having observed that many royals appeared winded or uncomfortable during long ceremonies, Philip had developed a breathing technique that allowed him to remain alert and energetic throughout hours of standing, walking, and formal interaction. The technique borrowed elements from naval training, where sailors learned to control their breathing during emergency situations. Charles watched with growing interest as his father demonstrated these techniques. Philip would stand perfectly still for 20 minutes at a time, but his breathing followed a complex pattern. 7 counts in, hold for 4, 7 counts out, hold for 4. But, unlike meditation breathing, this was active breathing, designed to oxygenate the blood while maintaining perfect composure. "A king who appears tired appears weak," Philip explained. And weakness in a monarch is weakness in the nation itself. Philip's dietary approaches were equally unconventional. While the royal kitchens prepared elaborate meals according to centuries-old traditions, Philip had quietly revolutionized his own eating habits based on his naval experience and his growing interest in what he called performance nutrition. During his naval service, Philip had been forced to eat whatever rations were available, often in challenging conditions. But, rather than viewing this as hardship, he had studied which foods provided sustained energy and which left him feeling sluggish. He discovered that the heavy, rich foods typically served at royal functions were actually counterproductive for maintaining energy and mental clarity. Philip introduced Charles to what he called strategic eating. Before important ceremonies or long days of royal duties, Philip would eat specific combinations of foods designed to maintain steady blood sugar and prevent the energy crashes that could come from traditional royal fare. He favored lean proteins, complex carbohydrates, and what he called sailors' vegetables, hearty greens that provided sustained nutrition. But perhaps most unusual was Philip's approach to what he termed adversity training. Having lived through wartime rationing, Philip believed that comfort bred weakness. Once a month, he would deliberately subject himself to controlled discomfort. This might mean taking cold baths, sleeping on the floor, or eating only basic foods for several days. Charles initially thought this was a form of self-punishment, but Philip explained the deeper philosophy. Luxury makes you soft, boy. And a soft king is a useless king. When real adversity comes, and it always does, you need to know that your body and mind can handle whatever is required. Philip's adversity training wasn't random suffering. It was carefully designed to build specific types of resilience. Cold exposure wasn't just about toughness, it was about maintaining composure during uncomfortable state visits or challenging weather conditions. Simple eating wasn't about denial, it was about ensuring that his performance never depended on having exactly the right food available. The psychological impact of these practices on young Charles was profound. He was witnessing his father treat the royal body not as something to be pampered and protected, but as an instrument to be honed and perfected. Philip approached physical fitness with the same strategic thinking he applied to military operations or diplomatic challenges. As Charles grew older, he began to understand that his father's unusual wellness habits weren't eccentricities. They were expressions of a fundamental philosophy about leadership, responsibility, and personal sovereignty. Philip had experienced genuine hardship and had learned that true strength came from self-reliance and preparation. By his teenage years, Charles was secretly practicing his own version of his father's morning routine. He couldn't match Philip's intensity or experience, but he could learn the basic principles. Physical strength as mental foundation. Controlled adversity as preparation for uncontrolled challenges. Personal discipline as the basis for public leadership. What Charles didn't realize at the time was how revolutionary his father's approach actually was. While other European royals maintained their health through traditional means, guided by court physicians and centuries-old protocols, Philip was essentially pioneering what would later be recognized as functional fitness, mindfulness training, and performance nutrition. Philip's methods were so unconventional that he rarely discussed them with other family members or royal advisors. He understood that explaining his Germanic calisthenics or adversity training to traditional courtiers would be met with bewilderment at best and concern about his mental state at worst. But Charles was different. Perhaps because he was destined to carry the enormous responsibilities of the crown, or perhaps because he had inherited his father's questioning nature, Charles not only accepted Philip's unusual methods but began to see them as essential preparation for his future role. The bond between father and son, often strained by their very different personalities, found common ground in these shared morning sessions. Philip, typically reserved and sometimes harsh in his interactions with his children, became almost philosophical when discussing wellness and preparation. Years later, Charles would understand that these early lessons from his father weren't just about physical health. They were about developing the internal resources necessary to carry the weight of the crown with dignity and strength. Philip was teaching his son that being royal wasn't about privilege, it was about service, and service required preparation that went far beyond ceremonial training. As Charles prepared to leave for boarding school, Philip gave him a final piece of advice about wellness and leadership. Remember, boy, every morning you have a choice. You can wake up and prepare yourself to meet whatever challenges the day brings, or you can assume someone else will handle the difficult parts. But kings don't have the luxury of assuming someone else will handle things. This philosophy would stay with Charles throughout his education, his military service, and his decades as heir to the throne. But, more than that, it would evolve and develop as Charles added his own discoveries and innovations to his father's foundational teachings. Charles's first real test of his father's unconventional wellness philosophy came during his years at Gordonstoun School in Scotland. The school, known for its rigorous outdoor education and character-building challenges, might have seemed like a natural extension of Philip's training methods. But Charles discovered that the organized hardships of school were entirely different from the self-directed discipline his father had taught him. At Gordonstoun, physical challenges were imposed by others and designed to build general character. But the wellness practices Philip had shared were personal, strategic, and tailored to the specific demands of royal life. Charles found himself secretly continuing his father's morning breathing exercises in his dormitory, not because the school required it, but because he was beginning to understand their practical value. During particularly stressful periods, whether facing bullying from other students or struggling with academic pressure, Charles discovered that his father's breathing techniques provided a form of internal stability that nothing else could match. While other students dealt with stress through various means, Charles had access to tools that allowed him to maintain composure and mental clarity even in challenging situations. But it was during his military service that Charles truly began to appreciate and expand upon his father's teachings. Serving in the Royal Air Force and, later, the Royal Navy, Charles encountered physical and mental challenges that put his father's training to the test. Unlike his fellow officers, Charles had been prepared not just for military service, but for the unique pressures of being a royal in military settings. Philip had anticipated this challenge. During one of their conversations before Charles joined the RAF, Philip had explained what he called double duty syndrome. You'll be trying to prove yourself as both a competent officer and a worthy royal. That's twice the pressure of everyone else around you. Your wellness practices aren't just about personal health anymore, they're about national credibility. Charles discovered the truth of this during his naval service aboard HMS Bronington. As the captain of a minesweeper, Charles faced not only the normal pressures of command but also the scrutiny of media and public who questioned whether a royal could handle genuine military responsibility. The breathing techniques his father had taught him became essential tools for maintaining authority and composure under this unique form of pressure. But Charles also began to develop his own innovations. While Philip's approach had been primarily focused on physical resilience and mental toughness, Charles found himself drawn to practices that integrated emotional and spiritual wellness. This wasn't a rejection of his father's teachings but an expansion of them. During long watches at sea, Charles experimented with what he came to call contemplative command. Using his father's breathing techniques as a foundation, Charles developed practices that allowed him to maintain both military alertness and a deeper sense of calm purpose. He discovered that the isolation and responsibility of naval command created perfect conditions for developing what he later described as mindful leadership. Charles's approach differed from his father's in important ways. Where Philip's practices were designed to build toughness and resilience against adversity, Charles was developing techniques for maintaining wisdom and compassion under pressure. Philip had prepared himself to survive challenges, Charles was preparing himself to serve effectively through challenges. This philosophical evolution became more pronounced during Charles's years as Prince of Wales. As he took on increasing royal duties throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Charles discovered that the demands of modern monarchy were different from those his father had faced. While Philip had operated in an era where royal authority was more clearly defined and less questioned, Charles was navigating a period of increasing scrutiny and changing expectations. The wellness practices that Philip had developed for a different era of monarchy needed adaptation for new challenges. Charles began incorporating what he called empathetic preparation into his routine. Before public engagements, particularly those involving difficult or emotional situations, Charles would use modified versions of his father's techniques to prepare himself not just for physical endurance but for emotional availability. One of Charles's most significant innovations was his approach to what he termed agricultural meditation. Having developed a passion for organic farming and sustainable agriculture, Charles discovered that physical work on his farms provided a form of wellness that combined his father's emphasis on functional fitness with his own need for meaningful connection to the natural world. Unlike recreational exercise or formal fitness routines, Charles's farm work served multiple purposes. It provided physical activity that was genuinely useful rather than artificially constructed. It connected him to the cycles of nature and the realities of food production. And it offered a form of meditation that was active and productive rather than passive and withdrawn. Charles would spend hours working in his gardens at Highgrove, engaging in activities that were simultaneously physically demanding, mentally engaging, and spiritually nourishing. This wasn't genteel royal gardening with minimal actual labor. Charles was digging, planting, harvesting, and managing his land with the same intensity his father had brought to his morning combat routines. But, perhaps most importantly, this agricultural work provided Charles with a form of wellness that was inherently sustainable and meaningful. While his father's practices had been designed around preparation for external challenges, Charles's farming provided ongoing connection to fundamental life processes that kept him grounded regardless of external pressures. Philip initially viewed his son's agricultural interests with some skepticism. The practical-minded prince saw farming as either a business venture or a hobby, not as a form of wellness training. But, as he observed Charles over time, Philip began to recognize that his son had discovered something that complemented and, perhaps even improved upon his own methods. Charles's integration of agricultural work into his wellness routine addressed some of the limitations of Philip's approach. While Philip's practices were highly effective for building resilience and maintaining performance under pressure, they required significant time and energy to maintain. Charles's farming-based wellness was inherently integrated into his daily responsibilities and interests. Moreover, Charles discovered that agricultural work provided natural opportunities for the kind of controlled adversity his father had artificially created. Weather challenges, crop failures, and the physical demands of farm work offered genuine difficulties that built resilience while serving productive purposes. During the 1980s, as Charles's marriage to Diana and his role as a father added new dimensions to his life, his wellness practices evolved again. The emotional challenges of public scrutiny around his personal life required tools that his father's primarily physical and mental training hadn't directly addressed. Charles began developing what he privately called family leadership wellness. This involved adapting his established practices to help him maintain stability and wisdom while dealing with the unique pressures of being a public husband and father. The breathing techniques became tools for remaining calm during difficult conversations. The agricultural work became a way to maintain perspective when media coverage became overwhelming. But Charles also recognized that his father's fundamental insight remained true. Physical wellness remained the foundation for everything else. Without the basic physical practices his father had taught him, the emotional and spiritual expansions he had developed would have lacked solid grounding. The relationship between father and son during this period was complex. Philip respected Charles's innovations but worried that his son was becoming too philosophical and not sufficiently practical. Charles appreciated his father's foundation but felt that his father's approach, while necessary, wasn't sufficient for the challenges he was facing. Their conversations about wellness during this period often reflected their broader relationship tensions. Philip would emphasize the importance of maintaining the discipline and toughness that had served the monarchy well. Charles would argue for the need to adapt royal wellness practices to changing times and different challenges. But both recognized that they were working toward the same ultimate goal, preparing the future king to carry his responsibilities with strength, wisdom, and effectiveness. Their different approaches reflected not disagreement about the goal but different understandings of what would be required to achieve it. By the end of the 1980s, Charles had developed a comprehensive approach to royal wellness that honored his father's foundational teachings while addressing the unique demands of his own time and personality. He maintained the physical disciplines his father had taught him but had integrated them into a broader philosophy that emphasized sustainability, meaningfulness, and emotional intelligence. This integration would prove essential as Charles faced the most challenging period of his public life during the 1990s. The wellness practices he had inherited from his father and developed through his own experience would provide the foundation for navigating personal crisis while maintaining his capacity for public service. The 1990s brought challenges to Charles's life that tested every aspect of the wellness philosophy he had inherited and developed. The breakdown of his marriage to Diana, the intense media scrutiny, and the public criticism of his role as heir to the throne created pressures that required not just physical and mental resilience, but emotional and spiritual resources that went beyond his father's original teachings. During this difficult period, Charles discovered that the wellness practices he had learned from Philip and adapted over the years weren't just helpful tools, they were essential survival mechanisms. The breathing techniques his father had taught him became daily necessities for maintaining composure during devastating media coverage. The agricultural work that had been a source of peace became a refuge from public criticism and personal pain. But Charles also recognized that he needed to develop new dimensions of wellness to handle challenges that his father's military-influenced approach hadn't directly addressed. Philip's training had been designed for external battles and clear adversaries. Charles was facing internal struggles and ambiguous situations where traditional toughness alone wasn't sufficient. This period marked Charles's most significant innovation in royal wellness, the integration of what he came to call philosophical fitness into his routine. Drawing on his long-standing interest in traditional wisdom, alternative medicine, and spiritual practices, Charles began incorporating elements that would have been foreign to his father's practical approach. Charles started each morning not just with the physical exercises his father had taught him, but with periods of contemplation that drew from various wisdom traditions. He studied meditation techniques from Eastern philosophy, but adapted them to remain consistent with his role and responsibilities. Unlike withdrawal from worldly concerns, Charles's contemplative practices were designed to enhance his engagement with royal duties. The integration of these practices wasn't easy. Charles had to navigate not only his own skepticism about New Age approaches but also the potential criticism from family members, advisors, and the public who might view such practices as inconsistent with traditional royal values. Philip himself was initially suspicious of what he saw as his son's drift toward exotic nonsense. But Charles persisted because he discovered that these expanded wellness practices were producing tangible results. His ability to maintain equanimity during media attacks improved. His effectiveness in royal engagements, particularly those involving sensitive or emotional situations, was enhanced. Most importantly, his capacity to find meaning and purpose despite personal difficulties was strengthened. One of Charles's most important discoveries during this period was what he called service-centered wellness. Rather than viewing wellness practices as separate from his royal duties, Charles began integrating them into his public work. His visits to hospitals, community centers, and charitable organizations became opportunities to practice presence, empathy, and emotional availability. This approach transformed both his wellness routine and his effectiveness as a working royal. Instead of requiring separate time for wellness practices, Charles was finding that properly approached royal duties could themselves be forms of spiritual and emotional exercise. Listening carefully to people sharing their difficulties became a form of meditation. Offering genuine comfort to those in distress became a practice in compassion and emotional resilience. Charles's approach to physical wellness also evolved during this challenging period. While maintaining the functional fitness principles his father had taught him, Charles began incorporating activities that served multiple purposes. His continued agricultural work at Highgrove provided not just physical exercise but emotional healing and spiritual grounding. But Charles also discovered that the isolation of solo physical practices wasn't always what he needed during difficult times. He began participating in group activities that combined physical challenge with social connection and shared purpose. His involvement in polo continued not just because it was a traditional royal sport, but because it required the kind of focused attention and coordinated effort that provided relief from internal struggles. The polo field became a place where Charles could apply his father's teachings about controlled aggression and strategic thinking while also experiencing the teamwork and mutual dependence that balanced his often solitary royal responsibilities. The physical demands of the sport required the breathing control and body awareness his father had taught him, while the social aspects provided connection and perspective. During the mid-1990s, as his separation from Diana became public and the criticism of his personal life intensified, Charles faced what he later described as his deepest test of the wellness philosophy he had developed. The traditional royal response to personal crisis was dignified silence and private suffering. But Charles discovered that his expanded approach to wellness required him to find ways to process and learn from his difficulties rather than simply endure them. This led to one of his most controversial but personally transformative practices, seeking guidance from alternative healers and spiritual advisors. While maintaining his relationships with traditional medical professionals and royal chaplains, Charles also consulted with practitioners of approaches that his father's generation would have considered completely inappropriate for a future king. Charles's exploration of alternative approaches to wellness wasn't random experimentation. He approached these new practices with the same strategic thinking his father had applied to physical training. Each practice was evaluated for its practical benefits and its compatibility with royal responsibilities. Those that proved helpful were integrated into his routine, those that didn't were abandoned. One practice that proved particularly valuable was Charles's work with practitioners who helped him understand the relationship between emotional wellness and physical health. Philip's approach had treated the body as an instrument to be maintained for optimal performance. Charles discovered that emotional stress and internal conflict could undermine physical health in ways that traditional exercise and discipline couldn't address. Through work with various healers and therapists, Charles learned techniques for processing emotional challenges that were more sophisticated than his father's approach of simply toughening up and pushing through difficulties. He discovered that acknowledging and working with emotional difficulties, rather than suppressing them, actually enhanced his resilience and effectiveness. But, perhaps most importantly, Charles learned to integrate these emotional and spiritual practices with his father's foundational teachings rather than replacing them. The breathing techniques Philip had taught him became the foundation for more advanced practices. The physical discipline became the platform for emotional and spiritual work. This integration became particularly important as Charles's role as a father became more prominent during this difficult period. His sons William and Harry were watching not only how their father handled public criticism and personal challenges, but also how he maintained his health and effectiveness under pressure. Charles discovered that modeling wellness for his children required demonstrating not just toughness and discipline, but also adaptability and growth. Unlike his father's generation, which had valued stoic endurance above all else, Charles recognized that his children were growing up in a world where emotional intelligence and psychological awareness were increasingly important. This meant adapting his wellness practices to serve not just his own needs but also his role as an example for the next generation of royals. Charles began teaching his sons modified versions of his grandfather's physical practices, but also introduced them to concepts of emotional awareness and spiritual development that went beyond Philip's original teachings. The challenge was maintaining the strength and effectiveness that his father's practices had provided while also developing the emotional sophistication and spiritual depth that his own challenges had shown to be necessary. Charles discovered that this integration was possible, but it required constant attention and adjustment. By the late 1990s, as Charles began to rebuild his public role and personal life, he had developed a comprehensive approach to royal wellness that honored his father's foundational insights while addressing challenges that Philip's generation hadn't faced. The result was a practice that was both more complex and more sustainable than either traditional royal approaches or his father's innovations alone. Charles's wellness philosophy had evolved into what he privately called integrated service preparation. This combined physical fitness, mental discipline, emotional intelligence, and spiritual development into a coherent approach designed specifically for the unique challenges of modern monarchy. The foundation remained Philip's insight that a royal's body and mind must be prepared to handle whatever challenges arise. But Charles had expanded this to include preparation for emotional challenges, spiritual crises, and the complex psychological demands of serving as a public figure in an age of constant scrutiny. This expanded approach would prove essential as Charles entered the new millennium facing continued challenges and increasing responsibilities. The wellness practices he had inherited from his father and developed through his own experience had given him tools not just for surviving difficult periods, but for growing stronger and more effective through them. The relationship between father and son had also evolved during this challenging decade. Philip had gradually come to respect Charles's innovations, recognizing that his son faced challenges that required tools beyond those that had served his own generation. Charles had maintained his appreciation for his father's foundational teachings while developing the confidence to expand and adapt them for his own needs and circumstances. As Charles entered his 50s in the late 1990s and early 2000s, he faced a new set of challenges that tested his evolved wellness philosophy in unexpected ways. The death of Diana in 1997 had fundamentally changed his role as both a father and a public figure, while the aging of his parents meant that his eventual accession to the throne was becoming a more immediate reality rather than a distant possibility. These changes required Charles to adapt his wellness practices once again, this time focusing on what he came to think of as long-term sustainability. The intensive practices that had helped him survive the crisis years of the 1990s needed to evolve into approaches that could support him through decades of increasing responsibility and the physical challenges of aging. Philip, now in his 80s but still remarkably active, became an unexpected source of inspiration for this phase of Charles's wellness journey. Despite their philosophical differences about methodology, father and son found common ground in the practical challenge of maintaining effectiveness and vitality as they aged. Philip's approach to aging was characteristically straightforward and uncompromising. He had simply refused to accept that advancing years meant declining capability. In his 80s, Philip was still practicing modified versions of the physical routines he had developed in his 30s, still maintaining the dietary discipline that had served him for decades, and still applying the mental toughness that had carried him through war and decades of royal service. But Charles observed that his father's approach, while admirable, also had limitations. Philip's determination to maintain his youthful practices regardless of age sometimes resulted in injuries or overexertion that actually reduced his overall effectiveness. Charles began to think about wellness as requiring not just consistency but also intelligent adaptation to changing capabilities and circumstances. This led to one of Charles's most important innovations, what he called evolutionary fitness. Instead of trying to maintain exactly the same practices regardless of age or circumstances, Charles developed an approach that preserved the essential benefits of his wellness routine while adapting the specific methods to his changing needs and capabilities. The breathing techniques that Philip had taught him remained central, but Charles modified them to serve different purposes as he aged. Where they had once been primarily tools for maintaining composure under pressure, they became increasingly important for managing stress, supporting immune function, and maintaining mental clarity as his responsibilities increased. Charles's agricultural work at Highgrove also evolved during this period. What had begun as a form of active meditation and physical exercise gradually became a more comprehensive approach to wellness that integrated physical activity, environmental stewardship, and spiritual practice. The gardens and farms became not just places where Charles worked, but complete ecosystems that supported his health on multiple levels. The organic gardening that Charles had pioneered wasn't just about producing healthy food or protecting the environment. Charles discovered that the act of nurturing living systems provided a form of wellness that was particularly suited to the long-term challenges of royal service. Unlike exercise routines or dietary programs that could become monotonous or burdensome, agricultural work remained engaging and meaningful regardless of how long he practiced it. Charles's approach to nutrition also became more sophisticated during this period. While maintaining his father's basic principles about eating for energy and mental clarity rather than pleasure or comfort, Charles began incorporating insights from his study of traditional medicine and his experience with organic farming. The meals at Highgrove became expressions of Charles's integrated approach to wellness. The food was organic and locally grown, often from his own gardens. The preparation emphasized simplicity and nutritional density rather than culinary elaboration. But, perhaps most importantly, the meals themselves became opportunities for contemplation and gratitude rather than mere fuel consumption. This approach to eating represented a significant evolution from his father's more utilitarian view of nutrition. Philip had seen food primarily as fuel for the body's performance. Charles came to see eating as an opportunity to connect with the natural world, support his physical health, and practice mindfulness and gratitude. The integration of spiritual practices into Charles's wellness routine also deepened during this period. His exploration of alternative approaches during the difficult 1990s had introduced him to concepts and practices that he gradually refined into a coherent spiritual discipline. But, unlike some who turn to spirituality as an escape from worldly responsibilities, Charles developed practices that enhanced rather than diminished his effectiveness in royal duties. Charles's meditation practice became particularly important as his public responsibilities increased. But, his approach differed significantly from traditional meditation that emphasized withdrawal from active engagement. Instead, Charles developed what he called engaged contemplation, practices that enhanced his presence and effectiveness during royal duties rather than requiring separate time away from them. Before important meetings or public engagements, Charles would spend time in contemplative preparation that combined his father's breathing techniques with mindfulness practices he had learned from various teachers. This preparation wasn't about achieving a particular mental state, but about approaching his responsibilities with maximum awareness and effectiveness. The combination of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual practices that Charles had developed by his 50s created a form of wellness that was remarkably comprehensive and sustainable. Unlike approaches that focused on single aspects of health or required dramatic lifestyle changes, Charles's integrated approach could be maintained regardless of his circumstances or schedule. This sustainability became particularly important as Charles's role as heir apparent required increasing travel, unpredictable schedules, and constant adaptation to different situations. The wellness practices he had inherited from his father and developed through his own experience needed to be portable and flexible enough to serve him regardless of external circumstances. Charles discovered that the key to maintaining his wellness routine during busy periods wasn't rigid adherence to specific practices, but consistent application of underlying principles. Whether he was at Highgrove or traveling internationally, whether he had hours of free time or only minutes between engagements, he could apply breathing techniques, mindful awareness, and purposeful physical movement to maintain his health and effectiveness. The relationship between Charles and Philip during this period was marked by a growing mutual respect for their different approaches to the same fundamental challenge. Philip admired his son's ability to maintain discipline and effectiveness while dealing with more complex challenges than he had faced. Charles appreciated his father's unwavering example of refusing to let age or circumstances diminish his commitment to service. Their conversations about wellness during Charles's 50s often focused on the question of legacy and succession. Both men understood that Charles would soon need to apply his wellness philosophy not just to his current responsibilities but to the enormous challenges of actually being king. The practices that had served him well as heir apparent would need to evolve once more to meet the demands of the crown itself. Philip's advice during this period was characteristically direct: the practices that got you here will get you there, but you'll need to understand them more deeply. Charles interpreted this to mean that the foundational principles his father had taught him would remain essential, but their application would need to become even more sophisticated and comprehensive. As Charles approached his 60th birthday, he had developed a wellness philosophy that was uniquely his own while honoring the essential insights his father had provided. The physical disciplines remained important, but they were now part of a larger system that integrated all aspects of his health and development. The agricultural work continued to provide physical exercise, but it had become a comprehensive practice that connected him to natural cycles, provided opportunities for contemplation, and offered tangible results that could be shared with others. The breathing techniques had evolved into tools for managing not just immediate stress but long-term effectiveness and wisdom. Most importantly, Charles had discovered that true wellness for a future king required not just personal health but the ability to serve others effectively regardless of circumstances. His practices were designed not just to maintain his own well-being but to enhance his capacity for service and leadership. This service-oriented approach to wellness would prove essential as Charles finally approached the role he had been preparing for his entire life. The practices he had inherited from his father and developed through decades of experience would need to support him not just as heir apparent but as the actual sovereign responsible for the monarchy's future. On September 8, 2022, at the age of 73, Charles faced the ultimate test of his lifetime wellness philosophy when he became King Charles III following the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. The 7 decades of preparation that had begun with his father's unconventional morning exercises were suddenly put to the most demanding test imaginable, assuming the crown during a period of national mourning while the world watched every moment of his response. The wellness practices that Charles had inherited from Philip and refined throughout his adult life proved essential during those first crucial days of his reign. The breathing techniques his father had taught him became tools for maintaining composure during the most emotionally challenging and publicly scrutinized period of his life. The physical disciplines provided the stamina needed for days of ceremonial duties and constant public appearances. But, perhaps most importantly, the integrated approach to wellness that Charles had developed over decades allowed him to serve effectively during a time when the monarchy itself needed steady leadership. The practices that had begun as preparation for royal service were now being applied to the ultimate royal responsibility. Philip, who had died the previous year at age 99, had spent his final years observing Charles's continued development and refinement of the wellness philosophy they had shared. In their last conversations, Philip had expressed satisfaction that his son had not only maintained the foundational disciplines he had taught him but had evolved them into something more comprehensive and sustainable than his own approach. "You've taken what I gave you and made it into something better," Philip had told Charles during one of their final private conversations. "I taught you to be tough enough for the job. You've learned to be wise enough for it as well." This assessment proved accurate as Charles navigated the early months of his reign. The physical stamina that came from decades of disciplined exercise allowed him to handle the demanding schedule of a new monarch. The emotional resilience he had developed through his father's adversity training and his own contemplative practices enabled him to process his grief while fulfilling his public duties. But, perhaps most importantly, the service-oriented approach to wellness that Charles had developed allowed him to find strength and purpose in the very responsibilities that might have seemed overwhelming. Instead of viewing royal duties as burdens to be endured, Charles's wellness philosophy had taught him to see them as opportunities for meaningful engagement and service. The agricultural work that had been central to Charles's wellness practice for decades became even more important during his early reign. The gardens at Highgrove provided not just physical exercise and contemplative space but also a connection to the continuity of life and growth that helped him maintain perspective during the enormous changes of becoming king. Charles's approach to nutrition, refined over decades of practice, served him well during the demanding schedule of a new monarch. The principles he had learned from his father about eating for sustained energy rather than comfort, combined with his own innovations around organic and locally sourced food, provided the physical foundation he needed for his increased responsibilities. The breathing techniques that had begun as tools for maintaining composure during ceremonial duties evolved into practices that supported Charles in making the countless decisions required of a working monarch. The contemplative preparation he had developed for royal engagements became essential for approaching the complex challenges facing the modern monarchy. As King Charles III settled into his reign, he faced the question of how to pass on his wellness philosophy to the next generation. His sons William and Harry had grown up observing their father's practices, but they would need to develop their own approaches suited to their personalities and the challenges they would face. The relationship between physical wellness and effective leadership that Philip had first demonstrated to young Charles had now been proven through 3 generations of practice and refinement. But each generation had needed to adapt the basic principles to the specific challenges of their time. Charles recognized that William, as the next heir, would need to develop his own version of royal wellness practices. The challenges facing the monarchy in the 21st century would require tools that built on the foundation of physical discipline and mental toughness that Philip had established, but also incorporated the emotional intelligence and spiritual depth that Charles had added. The lessons that had begun with Philip's morning combat exercises in the gardens of Buckingham Palace had evolved into a comprehensive philosophy of leadership wellness that combined ancient wisdom with practical effectiveness. The unconventional practices that had once seemed like eccentric habits had proven to be essential tools for royal service. Charles's early reign demonstrated that the wellness practices he had inherited from his father and developed throughout his life weren't just personal health habits but expressions of a fundamental understanding about leadership and service. The physical disciplines provided the foundation for mental clarity. The mental training created space for emotional wisdom. The spiritual practices enhanced rather than diminished worldly effectiveness. The integration of all these elements into a coherent approach to wellness had allowed Charles to serve effectively through decades of preparation and was now supporting him through the ultimate test of actually being king. The practices that had begun as his father's idiosyncratic approach to staying fit had evolved into a sophisticated system for maintaining not just personal health but the capacity for effective leadership under the most demanding circumstances. As Charles looked toward the future of his reign, he understood that the wellness philosophy he had inherited and developed would continue to evolve. The challenges facing future monarchs would require new adaptations and innovations. But the foundational insight that Philip had shared with him decades earlier remained as relevant as ever: the body and mind must be prepared to serve, because service is the ultimate purpose of royal existence. The story of the unusual wellness habits that Charles picked up from his father ultimately became the story of how unconventional preparation enabled extraordinary service. Philip's rebellion against traditional royal approaches to health and fitness had created a legacy that supported not just his own remarkable vitality into his 90s, but his son's effectiveness as a working monarch in his 70s. The morning exercises that had puzzled young Charles as he watched his father through the palace windows had grown into a comprehensive philosophy of leadership wellness that honored both ancient wisdom and practical necessity. The breathing techniques, physical disciplines, contemplative practices, and service orientation that defined Charles's approach represented the culmination of a lifetime spent refining and applying his father's foundational insights. Most importantly, Charles had discovered that true royal wellness wasn't about personal health or individual achievement. It was about developing and maintaining the capacity to serve others effectively regardless of circumstances or challenges. The practices that had begun as preparation for royal duties had become expressions of the very service they were designed to support. As King Charles III continued his reign, the wellness practices that had sustained him through 7 decades of preparation continued to evolve and adapt to new challenges and responsibilities. The unconventional legacy that Philip had passed to his son had proven itself not just as effective personal practice but as essential preparation for the most demanding service imaginable. The future would undoubtedly bring new challenges that would require further evolution and adaptation of these practices. But the foundation that Philip had established and Charles had built upon had proven strong enough to support the weight of the crown itself. The unusual wellness habits that had begun in the gardens of Buckingham Palace had become the hidden foundation of effective modern monarchy.